Welcome, everybody. I'm Mary-Beth Landy, the Senior Trainer of the Training, Recruitment, and Support Specialist for Special Education Surrogate Parents for the Federation for Children with Special Needs in Boston. I have served as a family advocate for over 17 years, specializing in mental health in children and adolescents. My experience in trauma, both learned and lived, by parenting two daughters adopted through the child welfare system who struggle with developmental childhood trauma. I do speak of them throughout the presentation with my children's permission and anonymity, as they have different last names for me. Let me take a minute to talk about the Federation for a moment. Since 1975, the Federation for Children with Special Needs has helped families and children navigate a world that often does not celebrate or respect individual differences. What started as a small group of parents advocating for their children grew into one of the first federally funded parent centers in the country. The Federation ensures that children with special needs are able to reach their full potential, and we believe the best way to do this is to empower families so that they have the information and resources they need for their children and build effective engagement with professionals that support them. The Federation has provided a model not only for Massachusetts, but also for the US, and even countries whose leaders have visited us to get advice about services for children and family with special needs. So we are not in Kansas anymore. This is part one of a two-part training. So we will be covering a certain portion of it in the first part of the training and then an additional portion in the second part. Just so you're aware of that as we go through the training today, not everything is covered in the first section. So we are looking at special education through the landscape of the child welfare system. I would like to give you a trigger warning that this presentation discusses childhood trauma, how it affects children and the children in the welfare system. If you find that this is bothersome to you, you are more than welcome to take care of yourself. If you feel triggered, please feel free to step away from the presentation and do what you can do to ground yourself. Remember that you need to take care of, in order to take care of others, you need to take care of yourself first. So I'd like to actually do a method of grounding that you can use during the presentation or at any time, actually. You can even do it in the middle of an IEP meeting. So it's called seat and feet. So I would ask you to get comfortable in the chair that you're sitting in, that your feet touch the ground, and take a moment to breathe deeply. Inhale on 3. And slowly exhale. Let's do that again. Inhale to 3. And slowly exhale. Now I'd like you to feel what the seat feels like to you. Is it hard? Is it soft? Can you feel the fabric? Do you feel your buttocks against the back of the chair? Possibly your lower back against the back of the chair. Really feel what it feels like to be sitting in your chair. Now take a moment to imagine your energy going from the top of your legs down to your feet. And let that energy just flow down slowly. Now feel what it feels like for your feet to be solidly planted on the ground. Feel that energy move through your feet and into the ground. Now take a moment to go back to your breath. Inhale on 3 and slowly exhale. Inhale on 3 and slowly exhale. So anytime you find yourself possibly triggered or having difficulty during the presentation or at other times, feel free to stop for a moment and think about what does it feel like to sit in your chair. I call this the seat and feet method. So today, skip the slide, we're going to be talking about the neuroscience of developmental childhood trauma and its impact on education, learning, and relationship development. We're going to talk about the ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, otherwise known as ACEs. And we're going to learn about interpreting challenging behaviors as a form of communication. I use the phrase developmental childhood trauma and also sometimes refer to it as complex childhood trauma, meaning that the child is affected neurologically. It's something that science has been studying and continues to study, but it offers hope that the developmental aspect of the neuroscience can be repaired. So let's talk about the developing neurology. Developmental childhood trauma happens over a period of time. It usually happens from in utero to the age of 3, which are the important ages developmentally for a child. It is usually more than one event of maltreatment. So this differs from a single event trauma. It is considered to be multimodal, meaning that there is rarely a cause of, say, physical abuse without also having multiple emotional abuse as well. In Massachusetts, we refer to the children in the Department of Children and Families. Most of the children in DCF custody, or Department of Family and Children's Custody, are removed not because of abuse, but because of neglect. So profound neglect is the primary situation for many of the children. 86% of children in DCF custody have been removed because of home neglect, as well as homelessness and poverty. There is always an overlying neglect when there is abuse. So they have found that the neglect is prevalent, which in many cases has allowed for the abuse to take place. And the adverse experiences are almost completely environmentally induced. So I do want to just explain that the single event trauma does have an impact on the brain, but it doesn't necessarily impact the development of the child, depending on what happens with the child and those around him. So if a mother who is pregnant has a situation where they're living in domestic violence or using substance abuse, maybe in a highly stressful situation, the toxic stressors in her body are passed, just like the blood and the nutrients are also passed through the umbilical cord while the baby is in utero. So you can see what happens to the mom can definitely affect the development of the baby's brain, because this is a key learning time, growth time for the baby while they're in utero. The further along the pregnancy, the more impactful the stimulus is, as those are the times when the brain is really forming. It's especially true for parents who are in situations where the toxic stress is at a very high level. So ancestor trauma, also in intergenerational trauma, it is something that is being studied. We talk about resilience, and we will continue to talk about resilience throughout the presentation. But what you need to know is that ancestor trauma is about the past, present, and the future. It is racial trauma is a form of ancestor trauma. It is one that is definitely felt in current times with what's been going on in society. So we will touch on that as we go throughout the presentation as well. So this is a picture of an actual brain, approximately 12 years old, of the trillions of neurons. The lower brain is what we would term as a typical or healthy brain. You can see the number of neural connections that are taking place in that brain in the activity level. The colors indicate the activity level. So for that particular brain, there's a lot of activity level that's going on in the frontal cortex of the brain, as well as in the hippocampus. In the top picture is a child who's been through severe trauma. You can see the limitations of the neural connections. So if the neural connections aren't there or have not developed because we have a use it or prune it system, you will find that there are limitations to what the child can do developmentally because there aren't connections to make that happen. Dr. Bruce Perry, some of you may be aware of his work. Dr. Bruce Perry works out of Houston with many children in the child welfare system, and he looks at the child's brain structure. Again, these are two brains, the healthy brain on the left-hand side and the severely traumatized brain on the right-hand side. And if you'll notice, not only what's telling about this is the size of the structure of the brain, but also the images show the overdevelopment of the reactive part of the brain that is on high alert. That is the early brain, or what we like to call the lizard brain, is on high alert. And this is probably due to the fact because this, again, is a severely traumatized child. So I'd like to take a minute and show you a video about, it's called the still face experiment with some dads. What I'd like you to do is focus on the baby's eyes. And it'll give you an idea of what can happen if a child has limited experience with their biological parents. Sorry about that. That was me.
What we've learned over the years is that babies are much more capable than we initially imagined, but they're also much more vulnerable. And in Ed Tronick's still face experiment, we get to see both in a very short period. We see the baby and the dad playing together in their routines. There are things that they know about each other and things that they do together. And it's fun. And then we ask the dad to turn away, and when he turns back, to keep his face completely still and not respond to the baby. And the results are almost immediate, and they're devastating. The baby looks to the dad and tries to get the dad to get back into those games. Hey, we were just playing just a minute ago, weren't we? We were having fun. What's going on? And then the baby starts to get frustrated when that doesn't work. So she'll have to look away and look around the room and find something else and then look back and say, now can we play? And within 3 minutes, the baby has really dissolved. She is trying to get out of the chair. She's uncomfortable. She's reaching out to Dad. She's crying. And then we ask the dad to turn away again. And when he turns back, to go back to being regular dad. And it's a joyous reunion. They get back into their routines, the things that they do together, the things that they were just doing 3 minutes before. And the baby settles down and gets back to the comfort zone that she's developed with the dad. What we see in the still face experiment is how able the child is to initiate and be part of the relationship between the father and the child, but also how much she depends on that relationship in order to keep an even keel. And when she's grounded and comfortable, she can explore the world. She can meet new people. She can try new things, and she's got that safe base that she can always rely on. And there's a trust level there. We can only begin to imagine what it's like for babies whose life is like that 3 minutes all of the time. And they don't get that responsiveness, and they don't get any help getting back to an even keel. And the results can be very tragic. They can have trouble trusting people, they can have trouble relating to people, and they can have trouble being calm enough so that they can explore the world and take part in the world. So we know that those initial relationships, that initial responsiveness and interaction between the father and the baby are keys to the baby's success as a child and as an adult.
Happens and get a sense for how these kids must feel when they feel so lost and ungrounded. So that supportive and safe environment is absolutely key for early development. And one of the situations that happens with children in the child welfare system is that when they are removed from their birth family, it becomes a re-traumatizing experience because they've lost that connection that they have with siblings, grandparents, cousins. And one of the situations that happens, a happy hormone that we have, a powerful hormone in our body called oxytocin, it allows one to be able to socialize, to understand another's perspective. And it's a hormone that we produce when we have a close relationship with a parent. In fact, there's a surge of it when a child is born vaginally, allowing for the production of milk flow and the bonding with the child. But when the child has been removed from their primary caregiver, the oxytocin stops producing for both the child as well as the adult. So you can see how that can start to limit the situation that we have with children who have been traumatized by the removal of their parents. So I wanted to just break down the brain into a little bit more understandable sections. So we break it down into 3 sections in this illustration. The most active part of the brain is actually the small part, the primary part called the amygdala, and that's part of the lizard brain, as well as the brainstem. It is the part of the brain that controls what we don't need to think about to have control. Our blood pressure, our rhythm of our heart beating, things that we don't have to think about. I wonder if I should, if my blood should flow yet or not. It's the part of the brain that also allows the individuals for the fight, flight, flock, or freeze response when it comes to danger, because we don't want to have to think about that either. So I live in a section of Massachusetts that actually has bears in the neighborhood. And one of the things that could happen, you're walking down a path and you come upon a black bear. You don't want to have to think about, should I respond? Shouldn't I respond? What's the best thing to do? You just want your body to go into one of those responses and not be thinking about how to do that. So that is something that's very important for our survival. The third part of the brain to develop is the limbic system, which develops very early after birth. That is the mammal portion of the brain. It develops in the arms of mom and dad. It helps the child to take perspective of their environment, of what's safe and what's not safe. The lizard part of the brain, or primitive part of the brain, is still working, and it's working very vigilantly. But this is where we start to have the capacity to be able to think. It has to do with our feelings, our emotions, our attachments. So think about an example of if you've ever been near a car accident. You're driving down the highway and someone stops suddenly in front of you. You have that adrenaline rush that we get, the cortisol rush that happens, and we respond instantaneously. We don't think about the trajectory of the car, how fast it's going, when we should put the brakes on. It just responds by automatic instinct. And that's what's happening in these portions of the brain. And you feel, it takes a little while to also feel those hormones decrease, but they do decrease for most people. So doctors have found, however, that kids have those hormones in kids are found in higher levels for children that are traumatized, because they have found that children who develop sexually much earlier than their peers because of the survival of the species, and that's common in war zones, things like that. When the birth hormone shut down, many Romanian kids had the failure to thrive, however. So their physical being, their bone structure was much, much smaller, as you had seen in the image with the two pictures of the two skulls. There was a failure to thrive for kids in the Romanian orphanages who were severely traumatized. And that was a study done with Dr. Charles Nelson from Mass General Hospital. So the final portion of the brain, the cortex portion, is where we start to learn our abstract thought, our imagination, our reasoning, our consciousness. So the traumatic events that activate the systems of the brain and the body are required for survival are the stress hormones of cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine. Adrenaline is known as epinephrine. So cortisol, one of the stress hormones, is a good hormone. We need this to survive. The problem is when we have it at high levels, and Dr. Bruce Perry discovered that kids with trauma have high levels and consistent levels of cortisol in their system, which drastically affect their ability to reach REM sleep, and many times looks something like chronic fatigue. It also causes high blood sugar levels and asthma in many kids. So you can see that it's many times a good thing, but at high levels and a consistently high level, because you may live in an environment where the bear comes home every night, and so you're staying at that high level of cortisol, really can have a detrimental effect on children. As can adrenaline. When it enters the bloodstream, it sparks a series of responses geared towards a perceived threat. The responses include a rush of energy, allowing the muscles to activate quickly and powerfully. It increases the body's ability to clot if injured. It increases the hearing sensitivity. So you want to, in those situations, be able to know what's happening around you and be very vigilant about that. The norepinephrine is both a hormone and a neurotransmitter, and it functions to mobilize the body by increasing the arousal and alertness in the body as it increases blood pressure and heart rate. and it inhibits the gastrointestinal system in the body so that you can focus strictly on the survival aspect of it. So when you look at kids that have these hormones in them on a regular level, these are the kids that you usually hear people say, well, they went from 0 to 60 without any antecedent. When the fact is, there is an antecedent. We just at the time don't know what that antecedent is. But these kids are starting at a baseline of, say, 30 instead of 0. And it's something like trying to merge on a highway. If you're merging on a highway and you're already going 30 when you hit the end of the entrance ramp, and to get to 60 is not that far and not that hard to go, as opposed to being at a dead stop and having to go to 0, from 0 to 60. That takes longer. There's more steps involved in it. You're more likely to see things as they go along. So when teachers say that or adults say that, the reality is it's not that there were no antecedents or triggers for these kids. It's just that it happens so quickly because they are at a much higher level. So the stress reactivity versus cognitive responsiveness. The stress survival responses, like I said, are fight, flight, flock, freeze, and fawn. Flock comes from the expression birds of a feather flock together. And many times kids who have trauma experiences will find other kids who are vulnerable as they are. They have an instinctual survival technique to try and keep themselves safe. So they will find kids who are similar to them. And many times that's not their peer group. That may be kids that are younger than they are because it's safer for them. Fawn is an expression used for individuals that may fawn over or would be considered people pleasers. So these are people who would, my oldest daughter, Kendra, was a people pleaser. Her teachers used to talk about how neat their classroom was, and Kendra always was helping and doing things like that. What she wasn't doing was acquiring any academics in the classroom. So unfortunately, these are good things to survive, not so good things if we are talking about learning, because cognition, thoughtful cognition is shut down in these aspects. When facing brain danger, the brain will shut down all parts of the brain that are not needed to survive, like learning. Learning is a higher power and one of the last things in the brain to develop. That's why we don't have early memories, because the cognitive parts of our brain haven't developed enough in order to retain the memories, but the body remembers. The brain is not learning or building scaffolding for learning, nor exploring or learning the causes of affect or remorse at this point. So kids, thank goodness, may not remember what happened to them early on, but they are also not learning from their environments. If trauma was precognitive, the body remembers through the limbic system or our senses. So if a child smells or is reminded of a smell, it can re-trigger the child to think of themselves in a dangerous place. An example of this can be something as benign as the smell of a chocolate chip cookie. An experience that I had with my younger daughter was at high school when she was 16. She had a complete dissociative meltdown at school, and I had to go pick her up because they could not keep her safe at school. I picked her up and took her to her therapist's office. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to tell me what had happened. But after spending time with her therapist, she was able to talk about it afterwards. And what had happened was she had walked into the bathroom, girls' bathroom, after some girls had smoked pot. And the smell of the bathroom reminded her of the smell of her parents' apartment, who were heroin users, when she would come home from kindergarten. So she wasn't thinking about the experience when it happened. She wasn't able to put words to the experience because they happened so young for her. but her body remembered it, and it remembered it in the sense of smell. So it re-triggered her in the experience. She became associative, and it definitely colored her new experiences. In that particular situation, she was triggered without knowing what she was triggered for. And one of the things that can be very hard is these triggers are internal, which can make trying to do a functional behavioral assessment very difficult for these students. Sometimes it is actually somewhat of an art or a guessing game as to what might be happening if the student isn't able to put a language to it. And many times the students aren't able to put a language to it because they didn't have language around them. But it does color all of their new experiences through that trauma lens. So this is Dr. Bruce Perry. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's one of my idols, I'll admit that. He did an interview with Oprah Winfrey on 60 Minutes, and some people around trauma, and some people may be familiar with him through that. He has developed a neurosequential model in education, and it is based on the fact that our brain develops in a sequential fashion. And when that sequential fashion gets skewed in its development, it is going to cause adverse experiences. So his model looks something like this, where the brainstem is the smallest portion of the brain to develop, the earliest portion, and it is where our blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, all the things that we don't control are regulated. The cerebellum, the next portion, or sometimes called the midbrain portion, is where our arousal, our appetite, our sleep are controlled. Then comes the limbic system. It's where our attachment, our emotional reactivity, motor regulation all take place. So this is the next step of stage of development. And then comes our cortex, which, as you may have heard or may have been told for years, that it doesn't stop developing until the kids are in their late teens. Then neuroscientists realized it's actually not until we're saying their mid-20s. I have a friend who's a neuropsychiatrist and is saying now it is probably not until their early 30s, which makes me exhausted because my kids are only in their early 20s and I'm really waiting for them to finish developing in their brains. But you can see how the typical brain should develop. And that cortex is where abstract and concrete thought take place. So this is what is considered to be the sequential development for a child who has a trauma background. Their brainstem and midbrain are actually overdeveloped, and their limbic system and their cortical system are underdeveloped. So they don't have the same possibility for reasoning and thought, but they have an overdeveloped sense of an alert system. And due to the disruption of the neural connections, this can lead to brain functions that are delayed or damaged. If the neural connections are disrupted, then the brain functioning will be delayed. Executive function is definitely impacted because this is a higher order of thinking, a higher order of learning. And remember, our brain is a use it or lose it pruning system. So what is not used gets clipped, so to speak. This is especially true with the frontal areas of the brain where higher learning takes place, or the scaffolding for higher learning takes place. These kids cannot make decisions without instant gratification. Some of the helpful tools for thinking about this as far as an IEP is concerned is focusing on skill building. With social and emotional learning embedded in the classroom rather than consequences. And we're going to talk about punitive consequences later. Having a trusted adult that they can build relationships with, because that's something that, again, they may not have the ability to do that building relationships is one of those underdeveloped portions of the brain. And mindfulness is definitely shown to be able to grow new neural connections. So we're going to talk about mindfulness later on. The earlier that it can be done in a child's life, the easier to build resilience will happen. So I'm going to take a minute to let you think about that. We actually have a poll. If we can, Nicole, if we can launch the poll right now. So if you want to take a couple of minutes and answer these questions, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you there's a little quiz, just for me to see everyone's understanding. So please feel free to go ahead and take that poll. So just a reminder, if you click on what you believe is the right answer, it will populate for us. And if you're having trouble, I apologize for that. Give us one more minute. Okay, Nicole, would you mind sharing the results? So how might the developmental childhood trauma affect the developing brain? It definitely is all of the above. There are underdeveloped portions of the cortex and the limbic system, as well as the overdevelopment of the midbrain. Cortisol in high doses affects the child's ability to reach REM sleep, but also increasing the problem solving. So that is, I'm sorry, we have a double answer though. There's a typo in there. I apologize for that. Most memory is stored through the senses. It depends on how old you are as a child or an adult, whether it's stored as images in the frontal cortex. That is how usually we do experience it as we're older, but with children, it's usually stored in the senses in the body. And that is actually one of the situations where if you've ever experienced, and we can stop sharing right now, if you've ever experienced a time when you've met somebody for the first time and you kind of instantly don't like them, or there's something about them that you don't like, but you've never met them before, that's because, again, we remember through our senses. So if there's something about that person that reminds you of another person that you have known, you have met before, and you did not like, and that is seeing things through a new lens. seeing things through the lens of what your experience was for the first time. And so that's a lot of what happens for kids when they're re-traumatized. Something new happens for them, but they're seeing things through their trauma lens. So do we have any questions? If you want to put it in the chat, and if someone could just read those to me, if there's anything, I'll take a question or two right now. Otherwise, we can go on and do them later on. And please be aware of when you put something in the chat, you have the ability to put it in the chat under your name, or you can do it anonymously.
No questions at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to move on then. So I don't know how many people have heard of the ACE study. So the ACE study is a study that happened in the early 90s. There was a Dr. Vincent Folletti, who worked for Kaiser Permanente in Southern California. And he was doing an obesity study with women and was curious to know why there was a certain population of women that regained the weight after they had lost it. So he did a more in-depth history with them, and he asked them not only medical questions, but also some questions regarding their childhood or things that occurred to them before the age of 18. And he was quite surprised by the outcomes of that. And what I'm going to do actually is show you a quick video. It explains it much better than I do, and it has a little jingle to it. So let's play that for you now.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. And Folletti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems, and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation, and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students, instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
So this is just an example of the original adverse childhood experiences, which are the top of the tree that were originally asked in the study done by Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti. The roots of the tree are really the adverse community environments, which are now taken into consideration when looking at the criteria that can lead to situations of adverse childhood experiences. So what I'd like to do is to show you a couple of things that stand out for them as far as with children, that as the number of ACEs increase, and you can see in this graph, the number of ACEs increase, the underlying suicide attempts have increased. As well as this particular study, which was, out of this University of Washington University, that no known adverse experiences, 34% of the kids who had no known adverse experiences had academic challenges, but that as the number of ACEs expands up to 3 or more ACEs, you can see how quickly it goes to 80% of students have a academic problem with learning. So I'd like you to take a minute and center yourself. This is the ACE questionnaire. I'm going to ask you to go through and do this. This is obviously completely anonymous since you are behind your own computer. Answer each question either as a yes or a no. If you answer yes, you give yourself a 1. Then I'd like you to add up the total number of 1s. And I'm going to ask you to hold on to that number for a minute. So I'll give you 2 minutes to go through and do that. I'd like you to go to menti.com. And when you go to menti.com, it's going to ask you to put in a number. This is the number that you enter. And it's going to bring up a question, which is going to ask you about how many ACEs that you had. This is completely confidential. And I will go to Menti and I will stop share and go and show you the screen. So. And I'd like you just to look at, this is the population that is in this training today. So The number of ACEs of 4 or more is about 20%, so it's a little higher than the initial study of 12.5%. One ACE is again higher than the original 26%. No ACEs is about what the original study had shown. So it's not uncommon for people to have ACEs. It is actually more common than most people think. So this is just gives you an idea of how many people I find in the helping profession are working to help others who may possibly have some adverse experiences. So I'd like you to take a minute and think about how you felt about the ACEs that you had. You can enter things in the chat anonymously if you would like, but how does it make you feel knowing that you might possibly have some ACEs? Sometimes people know that or they don't know that. But why don't you take a minute just to add something there? Just to be totally transparent, I'll let you know, I did not know until I had started really working and studying trauma that I have an ACE score of 5, which I did find surprising. My kids have ACE scores of 8. And so that is not surprising to me. It is surprising to them, however, because of many of the things they don't necessarily remember.
So some comments on memories that I try to suppress. I think it emphasizes how important mental health care is.
Absolutely.
Makes me feel like I need more proactive regarding, going too fast, regarding healthy lifestyle. Another person was surprised at their score. It explains a lot about how I respond and react. To the best of my knowledge, my children are less than 3, I hope. I always feel hesitant to give myself full credit for an ACE because I always feel like it wasn't that bad. I give myself a 3 or 3.5. Let's see. 4 helps me to continue taking care of me. I have a score of 5. So some people are telling their scores. I have a score of 5. I have health problems now after the age of 40 that the doctors are baffled by. Another person say we're grateful. Makes sense why learning struggles. I also have a high number of ACEs.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't figure out the Mentimeter. I've learned to appreciate that I didn't experience significant ACE as a child, occasional harsh words from parents, frustration, and I was hard on my mom, I know. Mm-hmm. Many states have state-funded mental health dollars. The PTI world and the peer worlds should become BFF.
Well, thank you everyone for sharing. I know we can go on for a while. I appreciate your honesty, and it is surprising for some people, not for others. It does sometimes take people back. And I commonly hear, well, it wasn't that bad. And I think that that's a relative situation. So thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. So let's take a look at, I want to move into some responses about developmental childhood trauma and take a look at how it affects children. So hyperarousal is probably one of the most frequent things. We talked about this, where kids are unable to regulate their emotions. They're fine 1 minute and the next minute they're at 60. I can't tell you the number of holes that were punched in our wall or kicked in our wall. When I was a family advocate for years, I used to give parents, when I stopped working with them, I would give them a container of spackle and a pallet so that they could repair the holes in their wall. So not surprising that a lot of kids have trouble with this because of the underdeveloped portion of a regulation, emotional regulation, excuse me. Hypervigilant. So we talked a little bit about that. This is a portion of the brain that is overdeveloped. You see it a lot of times in kids who just can't sit still. A lot of times with younger kids, they're very clingy. They have a tendency to do things that are anxiety, what might be considered anxiety signs for them, symptoms such as chewing on their shirts and being very clingy. It's the preoccupation with possible unknown threats. Doesn't mean there's actually a threat there. And this is one of the situations that this may play out in an IEP on something such as accommodations. My children had preferential seating in their accommodations, and that preferential seating was not the front of the classroom, but actually the back of the classroom with their backs against the wall so that they could see the window and door. Otherwise, if they sat in the front of the classroom, they were always looking behind them every time they heard a noise. Someone dropped a pencil, they had to turn around, so they weren't able to focus academically. So things may look a little bit different when we're talking about IEPs for kids with trauma. So the negative self-image is huge for these kids. Imagine being a child who grows up and has, say, parents who have a drug addiction, who the child feels like the parent has, in fact, chosen the drugs over them. So shame and is almost something that they live with. Particularly for young girls, it can lead to self-harm and eating disorders, body shaming. It's a sense that bad things are going to happen, and it just reinforces these patterns. Poor impulse control. Many times they don't have the ability for delayed gratification or to wait for things. They think that their coping mechanism is that they believe that they have things. I always joke that these are my girls, and that they suffer from primnesia. It's when you order so many things off of Amazon that you don't know what's in the package on your front steps when it arrives. So it does play out in things like lying, cheating, stealing in order to get what you believe that you need. So somatization, you'll definitely hear this a lot for kids. This may be the kid that is, the teacher's always saying that during math they want to go to the nurse's office. And it may seem as if they're trying to get out of a non-preferred activity in school. That might be the case. It could be the case that they have a learning disability in the subject that they're trying to get out of that has been unidentified. But often the somatization is real. It's not just something they're making up. High cortisol levels actually activate high levels of acid in a child's stomach. So they do have stomach aches. The stress hormones are causing them to have actual headaches. So many times, if this is not approached properly, it can lead to absenteeism, chronic absenteeism, which can lead to school refusal. And staying home is not socially rewarding for students. It may be safe for them, but for the most part, kids like to attend school to see their friends. So lack of attendance in class leads to lack of success. So we need to work towards a better understanding on how the physical symptoms definitely impact the kids. We use a phrase called compassion and accountability. And what we mean by that is that you can be compassionate towards the child and their illness and how they're feeling by sending them to the nurse, the school nurse, but sending them along with their work that they're supposed to be doing. So they are being held accountable for their work. They're not getting out of what they need to do, but they are in fact still able to receive some nurturing and care, a little one-on-one attention from the nurse in the nurse's office. So that is an example of what we mean by compassionate accountability. So the responses on trauma on the body function, attachment is a big issue that students have, not trusting anyone, having no sense of safety, trouble forming relationships. We talked about that lack of self-esteem. And they can have difficulty with sleeping at night or have night terrors, again, because of the cortisol level. That lack of satiation or appetite sometimes can also lead to hoarding of food, not knowing where their next meal is coming from. And difficulties or regressions in toileting, I'll call them skills. Enuresis. Our daughter had enuresis until she was 11. So it definitely affected her ability to have relationships. She could not do overnights with anyone because of that, or would not do them. She just had such a lack of sense of self and her body that she was not aware of what happened to her body, that she needed to use the bathroom, and then not aware of the fact that she had urinated. So it is common amongst kids who have trauma backgrounds. And we just talked a little bit about the attachment, but they have a lack of being able to take someone else's perspective, which is required for building attachment. And they're focusing so much on getting their own needs met that they are not necessarily focused on the other person or a reciprocal relationship. And they're over-focused on being accepted and being liked. My oldest was actually quite social and had a great group of friends, yet she still felt it necessary to steal some money from us, which was an issue when she was younger. She had this habit of saving receipts from things that she purchased. And we realized that we had a receipt in her room for 57 donuts from Dunkin' Donuts at 7:15 in the morning. Dunkin' Donuts is a block from her bus stop. So my generous kid went and bought donuts for every single person on the bus with our money because she felt like she needed to earn people's their friends and have friends by buying them things, which was sadly not the case. And because of those behaviors, she ended up losing a lot of her good friends. So we're coming to the end of part one. I wanted to leave a couple of minutes for questions. I will let you know the rest of the presentation is continued in section 5A, part 2. This is my contact information. If you happen to have any further questions, I'd be more than happy to discuss them or continue the conversation.